Well, President Biden wants to make sweeping changes to the student loan program. Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Good afternoon. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, inflation is a very big problem in this country. Of course, it is, it's hitting colleges as well. Today, Prudent Money contributor and college admissions expert John Hupalo is here to weigh in. John, welcome to Prudent Money.
Bob, good afternoon. Nice to be with you today.
You know, as I've said before, there is so much to talk about, so many moving parts when it comes to college, and we're talking about inflation, big country in this, big problem in this country, and you got to think this is hitting colleges as well. What type of increases are we seeing in tuition, and what are the reasons? And I know that there's kind of maybe a cycle of time where you have inflation hitting this country, and colleges have already made decisions. Maybe some colleges haven't made decisions. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I'll be really dramatic, Bob, and say, this is the most inflationary time we've had in this century. It sounds like a long time, which is, of course, 20 years, but the reality is it's the highest inflation rates that we've had in 40 years, since back to 1981. So yeah, it's a big deal, and it feels like for a lot of us it came out of the blue, right? Because we were talking about the pandemic, and then boom, now we're talking about inflation. And there's just one sort of side note to all this, Bob, and that is I hope you don't do this, but I love being on your show. But you have a great opportunity if you want to be a college president. They are retiring in flocks.
I've heard this. And it's funny not to divert there, because I want you to definitely keep with that thought. But city mayors are quitting. I think it's city mayors.
It's a nightmare. But I'll tell you, I think the inflation rate, to kind of get back to your first point, we're at the top of the show. This is the second in a double whammy, and I think a lot of folks are saying, presidents in particular, are saying, I took this job. It was a great job. I could go out and do some fundraising, maybe go to some great football games and hobnob and do what I like to do, get the faculty going in the right direction. And the pandemic came along, and they completely threw me on the side. I had no idea as a college president that this was going to be in my job description, to basically remodel the entire education system in like a 3-month system to get people online. So they kind of got through that. And then they looked over their shoulder and said, oh, yeah, that's right. Sort of all that free money the government gave away for as long as they gave it away, and a whole bunch of other issues now makes inflation the biggest threat and the next really big thing that the schools have to deal with. So you're asking the right question, of course, you always do. And what's really interesting, Bob, is the rate of increase in tuition is one thing, but the place where the rubber's meeting the road for the colleges is really in the room and board and fees. And for some of the colleges, particularly for public colleges, the cost of the meal plan and housing is greater than the cost of the tuition. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? Because the tuition is really kind of your salaries of professors, and sort of year to year, you pretty much know what that's going to be, and increases and the like. But fuel costs in the last year have run up 30% generally. In colleges, they spend a lot of money on fuel. Food costs in the last year are up about 6 or 7%. And colleges spend a lot of money feeding their students every year. So the colleges are in this place where it's a double whammy. They just went through the pandemic. They picked up a whole boatload of expenses they didn't realize they were going to have. And by the way, Bob, some of those are creeping into their current budgets. For instance, many of the schools have had to significantly increase spending on mental health for students. And that's continuing into this school year, and it's going to continue into the next school year because the students have been really bearing the brunt of a lot of the issues related to the pandemic. So, it's basic revenue and expenses. And on the expense side, you see your costs really ratcheting out of control in some areas like food, like fuel, like some of the healthcare costs. And this is going to lead to increased cost of college, no question about it.
It begs the question, just, a year ago, 2 years, over the past couple of years, we've been talking about like you said, the financial impact of the pandemic. Now you've got maybe almost to equal the problems with inflation. It makes you wonder, how many schools are we going to lose when this all is said and done?
Yeah, and that is absolutely happening across the board, mergers, school closures, and it's fairly predictable. There were, I think, a lot of schools, and I'm going to say a lot of small liberal arts schools that were very regional, had great alumni networks, but maybe they didn't have, more than 500 or 1,000 total students on a fairly small campus with no real endowment. And in these times, they are really under stress. We talked about this one statistic once before, Bob, and it's gotten even more exacerbated, if that's the right way to say it right now. But we talk about tuition discounts. So go on the website. And
right.
The cost of tuition is, $30,000. This year, the tuition discount across all the schools across the country reached an all-time high of almost 55%. So that's like a big deal there, right? So the revenue's coming in on the tuition side significantly down. The expenses are going up. So the question is, what does it mean today and what is it going to mean next year? Because in the education market, inflation is really lagging, right? So the schools have set their prices probably late winter, early spring for this academic year that's going to start in another month. So they locked in all those costs right at the beginning of 2022. They said, okay, this is what our revenue is going to be, meaning this is what tuition we can choose. The places where they are starting to ratchet up the cost to the extent they can, again, are in the meal plans and in the room charges. They're trying to ratchet those costs up a little bit more than what the inflation costs are.
So here's the $1 million question. Let's forget about inflation for a second, and let's talk about pre-inflationary times, where the college inflation rate year after year after year was averaging somewhere. You'd be a better judge of this than I would. Somewhere between 5 to 6%. How in the world could colleges justify that then? And how did they get away with it for so many years?
Yeah, great question again. And the answer, you're right, it was 5 and 6 times the rate of inflation. So when the inflation rate was like 1% just a few years ago, they were raising their costs 5 to 6%. When the inflation rate was 2%, it wasn't unusual for the schools to be in the 6 to 10% increase. And so why and how? And they justified it basically to spend money, many of them, to keep up with the Joneses. We see it here on the East Coast. I went to a school where they constructed this beautiful new luxury dorm with concierge service and all kinds of stuff. And it's expensive.
Right.
And they did it because they could get away with it. The other thing that we haven't talked about that's really important here is that the number of students over the last 2 years that are in school, about 1 million less than the start of the pandemic. And then you question, well, where are those students and where are they going? And disproportionately, there are reductions in the public 2 years. Almost 13% of that population is no longer there. That's over 700,000 students across the country are no longer in the public 2-year schools. The public 4-year schools are down about 250,000 students. And the for-profit private schools have the largest percentage drop, about 11%, but it's about 70,000 students. And the reason for that, in large part, is because of the pandemic drove away jobs, and so students couldn't go back to school. So you're seeing reduced enrollment, which means potentially reduced revenue, which means you either increase it by an extra normal amount, some percentage of inflation increase, or you continue to work really hard to try to get your costs down in an inflationary environment. No wonder all these college presidents are hanging it up and saying, I'm going to go try to do something a little different with my life. It's a very difficult time for schools. And that means it's a really difficult time for families, too, to try and figure all this out.
Sure.
Right? How do I navigate this knowing that the costs are going to go up and my family wages are probably not increasing at the same rate that the college inflation rate is increasing?
I misspoke. It's not city mayors that have been quitting in groves. It's school board superintendents. That's what it was.
Oh.
Correct that. At least down in this area, we've been seeing a lot of that. So, it begs the question, how long can schools continue? The thing about the inflation rate is that the rate itself, which I don't even think is real, I think it's very understated, can go down and fluctuate and whatever. I still think that the base rate of inflation, which could be 20 to 25%, it's going to take a while for that to go down. And it makes me wonder how many years can universities put up with that, and then at what point does it become a breaking point for parents and students? This is too much.
Yeah, let's get ask the breaking point question first. And here's why I'm so skeptical that there's an answer where there'll be some rationalization to a point where you say, okay, now we're going to start to see the costs come in line with the demand and have people who can actually afford these schools go to them. And I think in large part, Bob, it's because the brand name school becomes so important. We talk about, when you and I talk about college, in my mind, I see the picture of the 18-year-old student going off for 4 years, and that's the traditional student. That's actually not the majority of students in the country anymore. The majority of students are wage earners who went back to school. Maybe they're in their sort of early, mid-20s. There are a different profile, something like, and this statistic that I'm going to say has been relevant for probably 10 plus years now. 60% of the students don't graduate within 4 years. They go on, they need 5 years, or they need 6 years, maybe they're going at night. So this picture we have of, I'm going to say the pimply-faced 18-year-old running off to college is not the majority picture. So part of the reason for the increased inflation rate over all those years is that there's often just a focus on a small number of, I'm going to say, elite schools, either really great public university systems in the schools or the private colleges or whatever it might be. And we think that those undergraduates are the college population, when in fact they're a large part of it, but they're actually not even the majority at the moment. So it becomes a little skewed when we start talking about, what all this means and how families can react to that. So the question that I always try to talk to families about is, but you do have the 18-year-old going off to school and you want them to have a great experience. It goes back to the point of understanding the family financial plan to begin with. You and I talk a lot about planning to pay for college. What is it going to look like? If you go to an in-state school or school in-state, you'll get that in-state tuition, which is significantly less than going to an out-of-state school or to a private college. How will that work? What savings does a family have? What financial aid might they be able to count on if they're eligible for it, either a merit-based aid or need-based aid? There's a lot to it, as we've been talking about over a couple of years now. The idea, though, that the equation's really changed for a lot of families, I think undeniably that's right. But the bottom line is, for me, families can make a choice about what school that student will go to. A student will decide, I'm going to stay in state. Maybe I'll go to a community college and then go up to a 4-year school. They're going to make smarter choices because the economics are driving them to better decisions.
And what I've noticed is kind of interesting is that the student is also making these choices and thinking really hard about, say the parents are paying for it and it's a mixture of that, student loans and whatever, that they are coming to a point where they're being responsible and saying, I don't know that I want to create that kind of liability.
Absolutely. and it's a long time coming. And part of that, we go back 18 years from today, right around the financial crisis, when these are younger people, but not all of them. Some of them remember when they were sort of 8 or 10 years old, and maybe their parents didn't have a job anymore. There was a real problem in the family with regard to the economics, and they just look and say, we don't want that same thing for ourselves. The other thing, Bob, that I notice, and I see this with my daughters who are in their mid-20s now, they just look at the world really differently about what their expectations are, what they're willing to do, and what trade-offs they're willing to make. And I think when you go back to talk to high school students, that same kind of discussion is more real for them, that they are aware that it's extremely expensive. Most kids don't want to put their parents in a really bad financial situation just so they can go off to a college. And they're talking about that. And I think it's really healthy, and it gives me hope that they'll make better decisions going forward.
John's website, it's a great website full of a lot of resources, www.mycollegecorner.com. Go check it out. Let's talk a little bit about politics and President Biden. I think it was today that they came out that he announced that it was going to make some sweeping changes to the federal student loan system. That must mean election time is right around the corner. Let's talk a little bit about this, John, because some of it leaves me scratching my head. A lot of it leaves me scratching my head, and for you, it must drive you absolutely nuts. Let's look at some of this. Some of the key elements of the proposal include protections for defrauded borrowers. It says under the proposed regulation, students who attend for-profit schools that lied or took advantage of them could be considered for debt cancellation as a group, meaning individuals wouldn't be burdened to make their case alone. This sounds like a great headline. We're going after the big, bad, mean universities because they were fraudulent. But isn't that going to be a little bit tough to pull off? I mean, think about it from the standpoint of, obviously, all-out fraud is easy to detect, but how do you define fraud? How do you define ethics? How do you get a group large enough together to do a class action lawsuit?
And you started with the right word, political, at the top. This has been an issue for a long time, and it's the whole idea. They call it borrower defenses. How do borrowers protect themselves against a fraudulent school or a school that goes out of business while the borrower, the student, is in that school? So this is a bit of political hot potato that gets passed from the Democrats to the Republicans and back, depending on who's in the White House. So in the last White House, this issue around for-profit schools and borrower defense was put on the back burner. And it was basically policy-driven that there is a mechanism in place for defrauded borrowers to go through a pipeline to say that I signed up for this school. Turns out, they didn't have a library. They didn't have a career placement service. They didn't have anything more. And Bob, unfortunately, there were some schools that are in the crosshairs of the Department of Education that are not great schools. And for a long time, they were like truck driver schools or nursing-type program schools where it was just easy to set up a shell that looked like it was providing some benefit for students, and in fact, it wasn't. But the last administration said, we have mechanisms in place at the Department of Education to detect these fraudulent schools and to try to protect borrowers who have been wronged. The change of administration comes in, and they say, well, that might be right, but still, with all these trillions of dollars of debt outstanding, we need to help more students. And they identified very specific schools. And it's very interesting to me that the number 6 is really important to the Department of Education, apparently. But they're going to forgive $6 billion worth of loans made to 3 different schools. So these are borrowers who went to DeFry, to ITT Technical, and to the Art Institutes. And the department says if you went to any of those schools, and there are about 260,000 students who will be eligible for total loan forgiveness, they went to that school, no matter what the outcome was, if they can prove that there was some malfeasance or they didn't get exactly what they wanted, they'll have their loan forgiven. Earlier this year, about a month or so ago, $6 billion in loan forgiveness for 560,000 borrowers who went to the Corinthian colleges schools. And these, the commonality here between Corinthian, DeVry, ITT, and Art Institute is they were all for-profit schools. So it was put right up front, you're coming to school, this is not a not-for-profit school, this is a for-profit school, and as you said, they were labeled as bad. And I'm not making a judgment. I'm just trying to present facts as I understood what the difference is between the last administration and this administration. So they lined up and said, we're going to help all these defrauded borrowers. I agree with you 100%. Great, really great soundbite here for someone who wants to make some sweeping reforms of the student loan situation. This is one of them that is kind of a layup for them.
Oh, these are great sound bites. That's what just jumped off the page to me. Political sound bites. That doesn't mean it's great for everybody else. So we got about a minute left. Talk about. There's a lot of universities in this country. How much fraud is really occurring in the system? Is it a small problem, or is it kind of a big deal?
So I'll say where you should have your radar up. If you're going to a school, frankly, that's smaller, that's more technical in nature, that is for-profit. They're driven by a different set of criteria. If you're just looking for a great community college or a four-year school, there are very few of those schools that wind up on the bad side of the ledger, the Department of Education. So if you can generalize, smaller, program-specific, maybe certificates, cybersecurity is another place where there's been a lot of issues about the borrower defenses. I would be a little more cautious. Let me say that. I'll be a lot more cautious if I wanted to send my child to one of those schools, or if my student were looking at it, I'd really do a lot of homework, make sure that that was a good school. If you're going to the other 7,000 schools that are in the state and they're not-for-profits and they've been around, the chances of you being defrauded are quite small. You have to be really smart about what programs you pick and how much money you borrow to go to that school, but your chance of being defrauded is actually up significantly less.
Well, John, great information. 30 minutes does go by fast. Still a lot to talk about. We'll just pick up next month. If you want more information about John, and his website is mycollegecorner.com. There's a lot of great information there. It's a good resource if you got a child in college or you're heading that way. So, John, always great to have you on. God bless.
Bob, God bless you as well, and good luck as a college president if you decide to do that.
I'll keep that in mind. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. I tell you, we're really blessed to have John come on the program once a month and talk college. And it's funny, we've been doing this now, I think we figured it out, 4 or 5 years together, and we never run out of things to talk about, and always a lot of issues. When you consider college being probably one of the biggest investments you'll make for a child. This is Bob Brooks. You got a question for me, please go to the website, prudentmoney.com, and send it in, because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time, keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.